Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Once again, my favorite holiday has come and gone. Going to have to wait a whole year for Halloween to roll around again. All the good movies will be on TV. Surprisingly, we wound up with about a half a container of candy left over at the end of the night. The kids just stopped showing up, but it was probably because Halloween was in the middle of the week and a lot of people had to get up and either go to work or back to school. Tonight, we're going to be talking about time slips. I've heard about time slips on many occasions. Now, this isn't time travel where you plan to visit another time, but an accidental slip to another time period. I've often wondered what and how this happened, and how would I handle something like it? The folks talk all the time about how they would be prepared to handle just about anything. They say they would grab their cell phone and take photographs or probably a movie. They would know how to behave so that they didn't wind up getting tied to a post and set on fire or locked in an insane asylum somewhere. Until you find yourself in some unknown situation, you don't know how or what you might do or how you may react. That's why training is so important, but how do you train for something like a time slip? Lionel Fanthorpe had a theory on how the timeline might actually look. Instead of one continuous string running in a straight line, he said maybe it was more like a ball of string. As two parts of the timeline crossed each other, the timelines merged, allowing the people on both sides to see each other. In some instances, they even interacted. Reverend Fanthorpe tells about a man working on the plumbing outside a bar. He looked up to see a group of Roman soldiers walking along the road right in front of him. The soldiers were all looking right at him. They looked surprised by his presence. The soldiers finally faded from view. Later on, the man discovered the road outside the bar had originally been laid down by the Romans, back when they ran all of England. What would happen if someone stumbled into one of these time slips and crossed over to some time in the past, only to find they couldn't get back? Frances Moberly was born in 1846. She was one of many children in a well-off home. Both her parents were highly educated, and they were both involved in teaching. Frances followed in their footsteps, becoming a teacher and then the principal of a very prestigious girls' school, St. Hugh's College in Oxford. As principal, she hired an assistant, Eleanor Jordan. Jordan was born 1863. She came from a family of teachers and historians. Since both had an interest in history, they spent time together during the summer breaks traveling around Europe and seeing all the historical sites. The pair set their sights on the Palace of Versailles. In 1589, The palace was nothing more than a hunting lodge. A rather big hunting lodge, but nothing to consider as a potential historical site. In the 1600s, the king was spending so much of his time hunting that the courtiers and hangers-on all had to stay in crowded buildings as they tried to run the country from the middle of the woods. The staff were forced to make do with what they could, sleeping wherever they could find the space. The king was convinced he should enlarge the hunting lodge so people didn't have to sleep in less than noble conditions. The hunting lodge was turned into a small palace. As time marched on, it slowly became a huge palace, with a city growing up around it. The palace became the seat of power in France. It was no longer in a forest, but inside a large city. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette expanded the palace into a collection of buildings and gardens. All the money they spent on the palace might have been better used fixing up the rest of the country, but you might say they lost their heads with the remodeling projects. After the French Revolution, the palace became property of the folks who were taxed to death in order to pay for it. Well, Moberly and Jordan had decided to visit the Palace of Versailles while vacationing in France. Staying in Paris for several days in an apartment owned by Jordan, they took the train to Versailles on August 1901. The palaces were filled with all manner of decorations. Fancy chairs that were more for looking at than sitting in. Paintings of all the folks that ruled France from as far back as people were making paintings. The guides tried to instill a sense of how it was to live in a palace back in the 1700s. I've been to places like this, and instead of being wowed by the museum-like settings, I was perplexed that anyone would want to live like this. But maybe it's because I've never been rich. The two women began to tour the gardens. They had a guidebook that showed them where to go and how to get there. They walked along the garden paths until they found themselves very much alone. The hedges made the gardens more like a maze than some greenery. In the 1900s, most folks didn't have the cash to travel around the country, let alone spend a month in Europe. The two women came from families that had money. They only worked as teachers because it was a family tradition. Their folks had inherited money from generations past, and they took up teaching more of a hobby than a trade. So as Moberly and Jordan were walking around the gardens of Versailles, they had the place mostly to themselves. They followed one path after another. So entranced by the scenery, they soon discovered they weren't sure where they were. They knew they were still in the Versailles garden, but where was the big question. Ahead was a white building that looked like an old farmhouse, but the kind of farmhouse Martha Stewart would own. It was big and in really good shape. It looked as if it weren't all that old, except it should be. It was in amongst buildings that had all been around since the late 1700s. As the pair looked around, they began to think all of these antique buildings looked new. Then they came to a man in period costume. He would have been a footman back in the 1700s. A footman was a servant who was more like a bodyguard. They would travel alongside a carriage to ensure it didn't come to any unforeseen interference, such as a downed tree or an unruly mob. The reason they were called footmen was because they traveled on foot alongside the carriage. If the carriage was going on a long trip out of town, they would be allowed to ride on the seat mounted on the rear of the coach, back where the dust and the dirt hung in the air like a bad dream. When the carriage was parked, they worked as kind of unarmed guards. The footman that the two women encountered had on a white wig. His jacket looked just like something from King Louis XVI's era. He had on knee breeches, white stockings, and black shoes. His outfit looked as if it had been made just for him. He bowed and ushered them through the gate. It looked as if the folks who ran things were going all out to ensure a memorable visit. As they neared the farmhouse, they saw a woman sitting in a wrought iron chair. She was working on a painting on an easel. The woman was dressed in a full-length gown that looked as if it was something that might belong to Marie Antoinette. Her hair was piled high, and she had on some sparkly-looking jewelry that caught the sunlight. The woman looked up at the pair as if wondering if she knew them or should she call for the guards. Moberly and Jordan smiled at the actress and moved on to the next part of the garden. They both thought the woman was playing her part very well. They wandered about, trying to find their way back to the main entrance. After way too many false turns, they spotted the palace in the distance over a lower part of the hedge. Arriving back at the main building, the women had to sit down to catch their breath. The folks working at the front were surprised when Moberly asked about the actress working in the garden. They informed the two teachers there were no actors working anywhere in or around the palace. Jordan looked up at a painting hanging next to them and announced the woman in the painting was the woman they had seen. This was the late Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. The staff all assured the two visitors the woman they had seen was not anyone employed by the palace groundskeepers. I've been to a lot of museums and historical sites. The folks who dress up always look like modern people in period costumes. The outfits don't fit all that well since they come from stock used by anyone working at the location. The way Moberly and Jordan described the people they encountered while in the garden sounded as if they were actually from the late 1700s, and they saw the two women as they walked by. I wonder if Marie Antoinette ever made an entry in her diary stating she was disturbed by two strangely dressed women who wandered about her palace as if they belonged there. The two married couples were on a road trip across France in October 1979. They were there to see the country and experience how other people lived. No touristy places for them. It was getting late, so they stopped at an old-looking inn for the night. Not being from France, they had a bit of difficulty communicating in broken French, but they got their hosts to understand. Dinner was simple but filling. Everything was paid in cash. The rooms were small and not very well apportioned. No phone or TV, just a bed and a dresser. The bathroom was down the hall, but this was to be expected in an old French inn. The couples took some photos, but this was back when you had to use film, which then needed to be developed. You didn't just go around clicking photos. The next morning, the two couples packed their bags and headed on down the road. They enjoyed the quirkiness of staying in such a quaint place, so on their return trip they decided to stop off at the old inn and spend another night. They drove along the same road and looked, but they couldn't find the building. They stopped and looked around, but no one could find it. After coming to the conclusion they had simply missed the inn earlier, the two couples continued on down the road. Once they got back home, the film was sent off to be developed. All the photos from their trip turned out, except for a dozen black images. These were right at the time they had stopped at the inn. Nothing but a black square where the photo should have been. The couples got together and they looked at their photos from the trip. They all remembered spending the night at the French Country Inn, but they had no souvenirs to show for it. The photos not turning out reminds me of a trip we took down to Dolores, Texas. Dolores was a small town along the Rio Grande River in North Zapata County. I couldn't find the date it was established, but the cemetery contained tombstones from 100 years back. I had a 35mm camera and clicked off a few photos in the cemetery. I took the film in to be developed, and when I got the prints back, all the images from the cemetery were black. No images came out. I looked at the negatives and they were blank as well. Next time I went, I had a digital camera and I took hundreds of pictures of the old buildings. Oddly enough, I could never find the cemetery. 1957, 3 naval cadets were on a map reading course. They were to find their way across South Suffolk, England. I've been on a few of these map courses. Lots of walking and trying to keep on track. Miles and miles of walking. The 3 cadets were to find their way to Kiersey Village and then return, checking off several compass points on the way. You had to find markers and log the numbers or letters on them. The 3 came into an old village that looked like where they were supposed to be. Not perturbed, they walked along the streets and looked at the old buildings. Very old buildings, but they were in really good shape, as if built only a few years ago. The cadets stopped and looked in the window of a butcher shop. There, hanging from the rafters, were 2 dead cows, dressed and ready for butchering. This seemed odd, since meat markets would have had a counter and the meat would have already been cut into portions. The condition of the shop looked unhealthy, something right out of the Middle Ages. The next building looked like a house. Once more, the 3 looked in the windows to see what might be in there. This place was empty. Not even a stick of furniture to be seen. It was at this point that one of the trio pointed out how quiet it was. There were no birds or animals making any sounds. The wind was still, and the trees were all stationary. It was so quiet, it was unsettling. They made a note of what they'd seen for their map records and then continued on with their mission. When they'd walked a ways out from the village, suddenly the air was filled with sound. Birds were chirping and bugs were buzzing. The 3 turned and looked back at the village, and they could see smoke coming from the chimneys. There were people walking about, and the wind was blowing the trees moving back and forth. Once back at their base, the three tried to come to grips with what had happened in the village. It had looked like a ghost town when they had been in it, but was then a busy village once they had left. Years later, the three were still wondering what they had encountered when a member of the Society for Psychical Research found a report of the incident. He began referring to it as retrocognition, or SPR. There's a new term for your parapsychology notes. In England, there is a part of town where folks have gone back in time on several occasions. Not long trips, but they wind up interacting with people from another time zone. One location is Bold Street in Liverpool, England. Liverpool is 120 miles north-northwest from London. People in Liverpool are called Scousers. The word comes from scouse, a meal made by poor people in the Liverpool in the late 19th and early 20th century. In 1996, Frank and Carol were on a shopping trip. Carol was en route to the bookstore when Frank met a friend of his and they started up a conversation. Carol said she would continue on her way and Frank could meet her at the store. Well, Frank, finishing up the conversation, began a slow walk towards the Waterstone bookstore. He rounded the corner and was walking towards the store when he noticed the sign on the building. Instead of Waterstone, the sign said Grips. Thinking that the bookstore must have been sold and was now under a new name, he was about to cross the street when he looked at the buildings around him. Things looked a bit off. Everything looked like a scene out of the 50s. Folks were dressed in old-style clothes. The men all had on hats, and the women were wearing scarves and knee-length dresses. The cars and trucks were all from the 40s. The cars and trucks are all from 40 years previous. Frank thought everyone looked like actors portraying characters from just after World War II. He tried to act natural and continued walking towards the bookstore. The displays in all the windows were for handbags and shoes. There were no books to be seen anywhere. There was a woman standing near the building, looking around in a confused manner. She was dressed in clothes from the 90s. She looked at Frank and had a look of relief on her face. She looked normal to him, and he looked normal to her. Neither of them said anything, but Frank opened the door and the woman followed him into the store. Once through the entry, the store was full of books. Frank and the woman both stopped and looked around. She said something like, "That was strange," or "That was really odd," and then she walked away looking at the books around her. Frank continued thinking about what had just happened to him. He'd been a police officer and was used to looking for details and keeping them in mind. It turned out the bookstore was in a building formerly occupied by Cripps Clothing Store. Cripps had moved out in the 1960s. Looking out the window, Frank saw everything was back to normal. All the cars were from the 90s and the people were all dressed accordingly. Long after the time slip, Frank continued thinking about what he'd seen and felt, and he tried looking into how it might have happened. In the 90s, few people looked into things like this. If Frank said the wrong thing to the right person, he would have been considered crazy. Not the kind of reputation needed in law enforcement. Gonna take a brief pause here, play a couple commercials. Don't go away, we'll be right back after this. If I can find the right mouse. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. Once more in the Liverpool area. Imogene's sister, Abigail, had just had a baby, and so Imogene was going shopping for baby things. She headed towards Whitechapel Street in downtown Liverpool. Not to be mistaken for the Whitechapel, London, where Jack the Ripper did his nastiness. As Imogene was walking along Whitechapel Street, she spotted a new baby store on the corner of Lord Street. It was called the Mother Care Store. The place looked brand new, so she went in to see what they had to offer. As she wandered about the store looking at all the things for babies and was surprised at how low the prices were. This had to be some kind of a promotional sale. She picked out a few things and then headed for the checkout. As the sales clerk rang up the purchases, Imogene handed over her credit card. The clerk looked at the piece of plastic as if it were some kind of unknown object. The clerk gave Imogene the total, and Imogene tried to hand over the credit card, but she wouldn't take it. The manager looked at the card and said they didn't use things like that. Well, Imogene didn't have any cash on her, so she had to leave without any of the items. When she got home, she told her mother about what had happened and why she wasn't able to buy anything. Her mother thought about the name of the store and then said that the store had closed years ago. There was now a bank at that location. Imogene's mother said that she had an account there. Well, not believing her, Imogene convinced her mother to go look at the store. The next day, the pair went downtown to where the baby store had been. In its place was a bank that looked as if it had been there for several years. Late one night in 1975 in San Antonio, there was a party going on in a college dorm. The rooming house was a very old building, and it had been slated for being torn down to make way for a new dorm building. Being a college dorm, there was plenty of stories about what all might have gone on in the building. One story was told that the building had been a house of prostitution back in the early days. One of the students wandered upstairs in search of the bathroom. There was a long hallway with doors on both sides. He opened a door that looked as if it should be the right one, only to find the room was filled with bright sunlight. This surprised the young man, since it was late at night. He saw two men standing in the room. One was Hispanic, and the other was a white guy. They were dressed oddly. Their clothes looked like they were from the late 1800s. And the two men were in the middle of an argument. One of them pulled a knife from his belt. Well, this led to the other man pulling a gun and then shooting him. The student sobered up quickly, thinking he'd just witnessed a murder. He ran back down the stairs and told others what he had just seen. Well, no one believed the story, but they all trooped back up the stairs just to have a look. After a search of all the rooms, there was no bright light, and no blood, and no dead guy. This gave everyone something to laugh about for the rest of the night. Was this an alcohol-fueled delusion, or did the student step back in time to witness a death from the time when this was a place of ill repute? In 1997, a family was on vacation in Derbyshire, England, which is about in the middle of the island. They'd rented a small cottage that was built in the late 1700s or the early 1800s. The mother was out walking as the daughter sat down to write at a small table by the door. The mother walked in and began talking to her daughter, and she was struck by the weird way her daughter was dressed. The girl was wearing a full-length dress with a high collar. In place of her long dark hair were ringlets, the tight little curls popular back in the 1800s. The mother was so shocked by her daughter's appearance, she didn't know what to make of it. The daughter was wondering why her mother was staring at her in such a way. Then, as she watched, the daughter transformed back into a modern-day teenager, t-shirt and jeans. Her hair flowed back into a normal, straight appearance. The mother told the daughter what she'd just seen. This did nothing to explain things. The mother was not the kind of person to hallucinate or imagine things, especially while wide awake. The only explanation would be the mother had slipped back into the 1800s and was seeing a girl from back then doing the same thing her daughter was doing in the modern day. I know our minds can play tricks on us on occasion, but this sounds more like time travel than vision problems. Well, not every time slip involved traveling back in time. Here are a few stories where people wound up in the future. In 1932, the war to end all wars had been over for 14 years. The British were doing their best to act as if another war was impossible. The term peace in our time was being bandied about. A newspaper reporter, J. Bernard Houghton, and a photographer, Joachim Brandt, received an assignment to head over to Hamburg shipyards in Germany to do a feature story on how Germany was building merchant ships. Little did anyone know at the time that at the end of World War I, while all of the Allies were celebrating their victory, Germany was preparing for the next world crisis. Those merchant ships that the Germans were building, they were actually auxiliary cruisers, kind of like battleships, only not quite as heavily armed. Arriving by ship, the two reported to the shipyard director's office. The reporter listened as the port director told him all about how Germany was moving into the next century ahead of all of the other countries. The photographer took photos of the office workers. This was one of those assignments that were dull and uninteresting, but still it paid the bills. Most news stories were about businesses and not very exciting. Finishing up in the office, the two stepped outside to get some pictures of the work being done in the yard. The two men were walking through the shipyard when they thought they heard the sound of approaching aircraft. At this time, there were few airplanes flying about, and you hardly ever saw more than a few planes in the air on any day. This sounded like hundreds of airplanes, all coming from the west. Looking up, trying to see what was going on, the two men began to hear the sound of anti-aircraft guns firing all along the entrance to the shipyard. When the two had arrived in the shipyard earlier this morning, there had been no gun emplacements anywhere in the area. After all, there was no war on. Black clouds of exploding flak began to fill the air. Bombs began to fall from the sky, exploding as they hit the docks and shipbuilding equipment. All around the shipyard, people were running and screaming in terror. Fire broke out as buildings were hit by flaming debris. The air filled with black smoke. It was 1932. No one was at war. The planes kept flying, moving on towards the east, and soon the air was clear of bombs, but it was still filled with smoke and the smell of death. The two British men were shocked, but felt they should do something to help. They offered to help look for injured workers. Well, the port director advised them it would be best if they left the area and left the rescue up to the experts. Jumping into their hired car, they drove towards the exit gate and back to the city. It only took minutes for the air to clear of smoke. Looking back, the two men were shocked to see there was no fire, no damage. The bombs had not fallen as they had thought. The Hamburg shipyards were still in perfect shape and putting out ships. All the way back to England, the two men tried to come to grips with what they had seen. Should they report it or keep it to themselves? Arriving back at their offices, it didn't take long before one or the other, or maybe both, wound up telling about what they had seen. Perhaps they thought what they had seen was some kind of a premonition of things to come. Maybe they had to tell what they had seen in order to warn the world of what was coming. For whatever reason, they told about seeing the shipyard being bombed by hundreds of huge, futuristic planes coming from the west, probably from England. Well, nobody believed them. Peace in our time and all that. The war to end all wars had been a British victory. Germany was incapable of starting anything, and therefore there was no reason for anyone to bomb them. It wasn't until 1939 that Germany invaded Poland. Then they got busy trying to bomb England into surrendering. The United States began manufacturing hundreds of B-17 bombers and sending them to England. In 1943, Hamburg was bombed by hundreds of Allied bombers, which all but destroyed the port city. The two men now had to decide. Had they seen what was coming as a warning, or had they somehow jumped 11 years into the future to witness something they were powerless to stop? In 1935, Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard of the British Royal Air Force was in the process of checking the conditions of some of the airfields under his command. He was being flown around the countryside in a Hawker Hart biplane. This was a two-seater plane used by the British between the wars. They left their home base at Edinburgh, Scotland, en route to Andover, and decided to fly over Drem, which was an air base on the Scottish coast. Looking down, Goddard could see the place was a mess. It had been abandoned at the close of World War I, and it was in need of a coat of paint and a lot of reconstruction. Airbase Drem had started out life as West Fenton Aerodrome from 1916 to 1917. It was used to train fighter pilots who were then transferred to France to face German fighter planes. Sitting vacant for 18 years, the place was overrun and the hangars were falling apart. Cows were walking about munching on the grass that was growing up along the runways. Goddard instructed his pilot to turn for Andover. As they flew towards their base, the pilot could see a storm was building on the horizon. The storm looked odd, like nothing he'd ever seen before. He advised Goddard they should turn around and seek shelter elsewhere. As they flew from the storm, it began to encircle their plane. The clouds were kind of a yellow-brown color. The winds began to drive the plane towards the ground. The pilot was fighting the controls. As they were about to hit, the storm abated, and they were now in clear skies. Drem was right below them. As the two men looked down, they could now see the runway was clear of debris. Instead of grass-strewn field, it looked like it had been recently paved. The hangars were all in good repair, and there were odd-looking planes being taxied about. The planes were single-winged, and they were painted yellow instead of green and brown from the Royal Air Force. The men attending to the planes were all dressed in blue coveralls. In 1935, ground crews all wore brown. They circled the airfield, drawing the attention of the men on the field below. Well, it was time to get back to their home base, so the pilot turned and made for Andover once more. They saw the weird storm, but they managed to avoid most of it. Landing at Andover Royal Airfield, Goddard saw the expected brown coveralls and the green and brown planes. In 1938, the Royal Air Force changed the colors of their planes to yellow to make them more visible, and the ground crews began to wear blue coveralls. This sounds as if Air Marshal Goddard had a time slip of about 4 years into the future. Drem Airfield was revamped in preparation for World War II. In 1939, the British planes were painted green and gray to make them less visible once more. October 20th, 1969, two men were traveling along Highway 167 at about 1:30 in the afternoon. It was nice weather, and they had the windows down. Back then, few cars had air conditioning. I had what was known as 250 air. You rolled down two windows and you drove at 50 miles an hour in order to cool off. As they cruised along enjoying the day, they spotted an old vehicle driving along ahead of them. It was going slow, so the driver pulled out to pass. The license plate said 1940 on it. The two men looked the car over as they went by. It was in immaculate condition. The car was a 1940 Pontiac Turtleback. It looked kind of like a station wagon that had the back end melted. Thinking this must be a high-end antique en route to a car show, the two men looked it over with interest. Then they saw the driver. The driver was a woman. Her clothing was from the 40s. Even her makeup looked period. She was white-knuckling the steering wheel, even though traveling at a very slow rate. There were tears in her eyes, and she looked on the verge of collapse. The passenger yelled out the window at her, asking if she needed help. The woman nodded yes. So the passenger yelled for her to pull over and they would try to help. He used hand signals to encourage her to pull over so they could see what was going on. The men pulled ahead of the Turtleback and then pulled over to the side of the road. They pulled to a stop. Well, shortly a second car pulled over right behind them, but it was a modern vehicle. The driver of this second car jumped out in a state of agitation. He asked, "What's going on? What happened to the old car?" The two business associates both looked at this new arrival, and then they asked him what he had seen. The man said he was admiring the antique car driving along in front of him when suddenly it just vanished in the blink of an eye. They turned their cars around and drove very slowly back along the road looking for any signs of the car, but it was gone. The three men discussed what they had seen. The two of them didn't want to say a word because people would think they were all crazy. After some back and forth, they figured there was nothing to be done about a car that had vanished, and it was best not to say anything to anyone. Sometime back in the 40s, a woman went for a drive in her brand new Pontiac. At some point in her travels, she found herself driving along some unknown highway with bizarre-looking vehicles flying by at ridiculous speeds. 45 was considered way too fast back in the 40s. In 1969, just about everybody drove fast. Gas was cheap and engines were big. You could get a muscle car that went 0 to 60 in 6 seconds right off the showroom floor. The posted speed limit was 70, and most people considered this just to be a suggestion. If you had a 427 with a six-pack, that's 6 carburetors, you didn't pay attention to speed limits. Somewhere, in some forgotten chest or trunk, There may be a diary written by the woman who had found herself driving down a highway in the future. Hopefully, she managed to drive herself back to her time and then had the forethought to write down her experience. This next story isn't quite a time slip, but maybe a dimensional slip. Time and dimensions are kind of interchangeable, so I included it in tonight's show. Just north from Brownsville, Texas, is a small town called Olmito. In the early 90s, a young girl worked on a ranch exercising and caring for horses. She was 17 years old at the time of this experience. Once her duties were done, she took one of the horses out for a trot down one of the dirt roads. She rode quite a ways, enjoying the scenery and being away from the ranch. At an intersection, she looked left, her usual route of travel, but not knowing why, she decided it was time to see what was down the right-hand turn in the road. This was just a small dirt road that ran back amongst the mesquite. After following this seldom-used road, she came to a small settlement. Just a bunch of beat-up old houses set off the side of the road. These houses were in need of repair, but they looked as if the owner didn't have the money or the ambition to do the work. These would have been worker cabins used by migrant workers who stayed only a few weeks during harvest season. The largest building was set up like a store. It had a few signs advertising things for sale. One sign said raspas, 50 cents. A raspa is a snow cone for those of y'all in the north. Raspar means to shave. A shaved ice with different kinds of syrup added for flavor. You'll still find these raspa distributors all across the South. Usually they drive around in an old van or pickup and they play horrible music on broken speakers. And kids love them, and so do some adults. Well, the teenage girl thought a raspa would be a good idea right about then, it being a hot, dusty day, so she tied her horse to the porch rail and went inside. The interior was cool and dark. Everything inside was covered with a layer of dust. This wasn't that unusual on a dusty dirt road, but the dust was thick as if from years of neglect. There were two young boys behind the counter. They were both dressed in all black, and they looked as if they hadn't been out in the sunlight for years. When they saw the young girl, they both looked at each other and chuckled. The teen was taken aback by their behavior, but thought they were just being weird kids. She didn't want to show how she felt to two weird boys, so she stepped up to the counter and ordered a raspa. The two boys did that chuckling thing again, and then one of them went to make the snow cone. She noticed everything in the store looked as if it was left over from the 50s. The Coke machine was the kind that served bottles for 5 cents. The cash register had a handle to pull in order to make the sale. Everything was some kind of an old, dusty antique. Even the window glass was filled with dust, hardly allowing any light to come in. Well, the girl paid for the raspa and was about to leave when the boys both smiled at her and she saw their teeth. They'd been filed to points. This finally weirded her out, and she made for the door. Once outside, she was about to mount up when the two weirdos from the store came outside. This caused the horse to rear up, and the girl lost hold of the raspa. It went everywhere, covering her with sticky syrup. one of the two boys called her by name, and she was surprised that they knew her. She asked if they went to the same school, to which they both just laughed. Well, she got up onto the saddle as one of the two boys reached out to touch the horse. This caused the horse to go a bit nuts. It reared up and, once again, this time took off running. The girl lost hold of the reins and had to hang on to the horse's neck and try not to get thrown. The horse beat feet back to the ranch and straight into the stables. Once there, it calmed down just enough for the girl to dismount onto shaking legs. The man running the stables was concerned as to what had happened to the calmest horse he owned. She told him about the misadventure with the two Raspa salesmen. The rancher told her this was unlikely, since there were no houses and definitely no stores out on the road she had been traveling. She was so insistent that the rancher decided to ride out and have a look for himself. The two saddled up two fresh horses and they took a ride back to the other side. The girl pointed right and they took a slow trot down to where the store should have been. There was nothing there. No store, no houses, nothing. The rancher was about to call it quits when he spotted where the dirt was all churned up by hoof prints. He could also see a set of boot prints walking away from the horse and then back to it, as if the girl had been walking into something. In the middle of these prints was a discarded snow cone container. It matched the stains on the girl's shirt and pants. Next time you're driving along some lonely road or walking down some street, and keep an eye on your surroundings. Be prepared to snap off a few photos should you find yourself in a different time. Hopefully, your camera will work and the photos will turn out. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Tell your friends to check it out. You can find the archives at strangethings.podomatic.com. I had to delete the first few shows from my page to make room for new content. Until I become independently wealthy, I can't afford to pay for storage on the website. If for whatever reason you want to hear the first few shows, send me a note at strangethings@arkanasa.com and I'll put them back out somehow or other. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?